Hey guys, welcome to Confessions of an Avoidant. This is Wando here. For those of us who watched The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, this past week we saw what was probably the most awkward conversation ever in the history of the show. And based on that conversation, why I feel like Sam M showed some patterns of neurodivergence, or someone who has very severe dysregulation around communication. Now, I'm not a big fan of doing armchair diagnosis of people, but I also just wanted to make this video because I'm seeing on the internet that people are just so quick to rush to judgment that something that they don't understand or that they find weird, there must be some villainous reason behind it. This is just a thing that people throughout the history of the world do. And I just think it's important to understand that people can exhibit certain behaviors, traits, patterns that can fall under a spectrum of reasons why they're exhibiting those patterns. Okay, so let's get into it. So the first thing is Sam was clearly so stressed out. He seemed very dysregulated. He was like heavy breathing. You could see that his heart rate was up. He kept clearing his throat, doing that which reality TV is never generous to anyone clearing their throat more than once. But yeah, you could see how much he was so panicked. When you're someone who has a lot of dysregulation around communication, you have a lot of stored negative associations with communication, you're going to have these physiological responses of feeling like, oh my God, I'm panicked. I'm in a state of absolute terror over this conversation. So while some of those questions and while the conversation in general for the other men is something that seems so normal, so easy, for someone who has a lot of dysregulation around communication or neurodivergent communication patterns, it isn't easy. It's not easy. It's hard. It's overwhelming. And this is something I deal with a lot. Like everything from work, giving presentations at school, even talking to a good friend, and having conversations around vulnerability, any conversation at work where I've had to feel like I'm on the spot, even if I have to utter just 2 sentences, it's like my heart rate goes through the roof as if I'm on a roller coaster. So I just really felt for Sam there because you could see it all over his body, how anxious he was, how panicked he was. And it was so hard to watch. The second thing is a lot of the things that Sam said came out so clunky. And this is one of the most frustrating things when you're someone who struggles with communication, when you're very dysregulated around it. You can have a vision in your head of what you want to say, but then when it's time to actually speak it into words, it just comes out so bad, and you know it in the moment, and then you feel even more embarrassed. So then your anxiety goes through the roof even more, and then it becomes even harder to communicate what you're trying to say because you're so anxious and you can't calm down. And so just a couple examples in that conversation. He said something about how Jenn was stunning and how looks fade. And I could just tell so much that what he was trying to say was something along the lines of, Jenn, you're so beautiful. And yes, we have a great physical attraction, but it's not just about looks for me. I'm not just into you because of our physical connection. We're not going to be these young, beautiful people forever. Like, I really like you, Jenn, because of X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 whatever. And this is the thing when you're very dysregulated with communication. Your mouth can't process as quickly what your brain is kind of visualizing you to say. And so it just comes out very, almost like a childlike way of speech. Another thing that he said, he was talking about how she's not his type. He was so matter of fact in the way he said it, and that he had thought or wanted the Bachelorettes to be Daisy or Maria. And I've seen so many previous contestants on the show have a very similar conversation, and it actually bonded that person and the Bachelor or Bachelorette closer. Like, I remember this happened in Caitlyn's season where it was Caitlyn and Britt. It was the 2 Bachelorette bachelorettes, and the men had to vote for who they wanted to be the bachelorette. Caitlyn ended up winning. And Jared Hyben, who's now married to Ashley Canetti, he was it Jared? I think it was Jared. He had voted for Britt. He wanted her to be the bachelorette. So when it was Caitlyn, Jared had a conversation about that and he was very honest about like how he wanted it to be Britt, how he voted for Britt, but was kind of validating Caitlyn and like essentially explaining how it like worked out that it wasn't Britt because he was having such a strong connection with Caitlyn, and that really bonded them. And I think it was very validating to Caitlyn as well. And I could tell that Sam was trying to say something similar. But again, when your brain gets so dysregulated and panicked, just terror levels of panic around what seems like a very simple thing to answer, it comes out so clunky. So again, I just felt so much for Sam. And then the last thing is a lot of times Sam seemed very frozen around communication, frozen within this conversation, I would say. Like he was stumped for how to answer things, almost like he was overthinking it, stressing about it too much, which just kept producing this almost freeze-like response. And I don't think at any point he was rude to her. Again, I think he said things very clunky, very clumsy, but rude, I don't think so. And I know that some people will say, well, he just kept copying her thing about ferocious love and he seemed to mimic her. But the reality is, you know, some people who are neurodivergent will try to kind of pick up the cues of other people to inform them of what they should say or how they should be behaving or feeling. And another reason that I feel this way about Sam, that he was just kind of freezing a lot and trying to like read from her, gauge from her how to react, is by how she ended the conversation. She said something like, you remind me of my exes, but they're in the past, and this conversation reminds me of so many conversations with them. People like him are in her past. And I felt like that was not a nice thing to say on Jenn's part. I really like Jenn so much. I love her, actually. I love her. But at that point, I felt like she was projecting onto Sam based on her past experiences. And he could have kind of lashed out at her after that, but you could tell that he was kind of like frozen, stunned. And I just think that's another reason why I think he might have some neurodivergence, might have some, you know, severe dysregulation. I think he clearly has severe dysregulation around communication because he didn't, you know, fight. He didn't flee. He just seemed frozen, like he was stumped for words. He didn't know how to react. The whole conversation was him just not knowing what to say. It was amusing to me because she kept saying she was so confused. She was so confused. And I noticed that codependent people will do this a lot. I noticed that codependent people will innately understand that they're just not compatible with somebody. But despite that, they'll cope by trying to stick around and fix them and have one more conversation and ask another question and then ask another question when they don't get the answer they want, and then ask another question, and they'll keep sticking around and trying to force it and fix it. And that's the confusing part. The other person isn't confusing. The codependent person's inability to just go, oh, I think we're incompatible here. That's how the dating process works. You vet the other person, and over time you collect information about how compatible you are. And if you're not compatible, you let it go. You walk away. The other person isn't a villain because they're not compatible with you. But I just see all the time that codependent people will say things like, I'm just so confused. I'm so confused. And it's like, you're not confused because the other person is confusing, or they're weird, or they're a villain. You're confused because you understand you're incompatible, but your own insecure attachment doesn't want to accept that. That's the confusing part. So long story short, I just think throughout Jenn's confusion and the way she ended the conversation, I think Sam actually handled that pretty well. He could have lashed out. He could have gotten mean, and he didn't do those things. And I think it's because he was so frazzled the whole time. So that is all I have to say on that. And yeah, I will see you guys in the next video.